Hello and welcome back to Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, get to discuss the crazy business of self-publishing with some very special guests. And today we have a returning guest who is very, very special indeed. It's Alex Kourvo, who you might remember from the podcast which we spoke about her book, The Big Picture Revision Checklist, where she went through all of the different ways in which an author should revise their book, which was fantastic. It was one of our favorite podcasts. But the thing is, at the very end, she teased a little about raising the stakes in fiction, some other things, some other elements we were really excited to talk about. And so we are very happy to have you back to do exactly that. Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you today?
Not too bad, hanging in there. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems Books and an author himself, Craig Touch. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland. And thanks, Alex, for coming back. So yeah, like Roland said, at the end, when you sort of talked about this other book that you have, which is based on raising the stakes. And that is always something that I think authors really, it's important to incorporate into your book to always sort of be raising stakes. But I'm going to let you sort of tell us what that means, because I'm sure that you will do a much better job of describing what that means than I would, but and then we can go from there. But so yeah, let's tell us a bit about what raising stakes means about your book, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, let's start with definitions. Let's just start there, because when writers start learning the craft of writing and they start looking at how-to books, or they take classes and they learn about story stakes. Everyone, I think, is pretty familiar with the two kinds of story stakes. There's the external stakes and the internal stakes. So the external stakes are like the concrete goal that the hero has. So you have to win the Hunger Games, or you have to survive the tour of the chocolate factory with the children disappearing, whatever that concrete goal is. And then the internal stakes, which are the thing that's missing from the hero's life. So that's usually a very abstract thing, like love or belonging or community or happiness. It's not something that you can point to. It's not something that's the answer to a yes or no question. You can also sort of think of it in terms of wants and needs. So what a hero wants is the external goal, and what they need is the internal stakes. So the external stakes and the internal stakes. A great example of that is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, where Ebenezer Scrooge wants money. He works all the time. He even works on Christmas Day because he just wants money. But what he needs is love. What he needs is human connection and to be connected with his family and with his community. So I think a lot of us are familiar with those, and we know that we have to have those two kinds of stakes in our stories. But there's a third kind of stakes that a lot of people don't talk about. It doesn't get a lot of attention with how-to books and classes. But that third kinds of stakes is still really, really important. And that's the personal stakes. Those are the stakes that come right at the beginning of a novel, before the midpoint. And when a hero starts out the book, they're usually only concerned with these smaller personal stakes. The bigger external stakes and the bigger internal change that they're going to go through, that doesn't come until later. They start out with sort of a much smaller goal. Like, for example, in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy just wants to go home. She doesn't have this goal of killing the witch and like basically, having regime change in Oz. She just, she's just like, I just got to go home. I'm just going to follow the yellow brick road to the Emerald City, and I'm going to go home. Or like in Jurassic Park, Dr. Grant just wants to, he's digging for fossils in Montana, and his dig is really underfunded, and he just wants money to complete this dig. He doesn't really want to go to Costa Rica and like run away from, dinosaurs that are trying to eat him. That's not what he wants. He just wants to fund his dig. So when Hammond comes to him and says, hey, if you come and look at my dinosaur park, I'll give you money for your dig, he agrees to it. So these smaller goals at the beginning of your story are super important because they'll help to bring your reader on board. These are smaller goals. These are really relatable goals. And it's something that the reader will understand and relate to, so that later on, when the dinosaurs escape from their cages and are eating everyone, the reader's going to really, really be invested. And here's where I think writers get into trouble, because they're told constantly that they have to raise the stakes. They're told that they have to start out with these big, important things, and then they have to continually raise the stakes through the story. But it's not really true. The big, important stakes don't really come in until right around midpoint. That's when those bigger stakes come into play. I mean, that's when Dorothy finds out that the wizard isn't going to send her home unless she gets the broomstick. That's when the dinosaurs escape from their cages and start eating everyone in Jurassic Park. And that's when the children start disappearing in the factory tour in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So when people say raise the stakes, they're really talking about revealing those stakes at midpoint. So that's usually the time when you want to really make those big, big stakes come into the foreground. I think the problem is, I have gone to writers' conferences. I have sat on panels with other editors and with agents. I have read their blogs, and a lot of them are like, oh, those main stakes have to be apparent right in chapter 1. But that really isn't true. I mean, if you just go to your own bookshelf and you look at the bestsellers on your bookshelf, you'll see that they all start with those smaller personal stakes. So
Wow.
Before I go any further, I feel like I've been talking a long time. I might, pause for a second, ask if you have any questions.
Yeah, as a writer, I really appreciated that. I just wanted to say, like, that was like putting it like that. I was thinking of all the different stories which I really like, and you're right. There have been those goals that resonate with you, and they make the character relatable because they're kind of like achievable, and then it's like whoop, something much more serious. So I thought that was amazing.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I haven't really thought about, when I think about stakes. Well, first I think Omaha, but no, when you think about stakes, I haven't really thought about it in terms of like that's the goal. I haven't sort of equated it as the same thing as like the goal of the story. Like, I've been reading a lot of make my way through the Lee Child, Jack Reacher books, and so a lot of that. Well, in those books, you usually have no idea at the beginning of the book what it's even about, right? It's Jack Reacher's walking down the street, and then all of a sudden, for some reason, every book he gets involved in some massive conspiracy or whatever. But in his, you're never really sure what those stakes are going in, right? And going chapter to chapter, you see those stakes getting raised. Like, first, let's do this thing. This person got kidnapped, and then he gets kidnapped, and then and then he's got to break out, and then but now they're gonna kill this person, and the stakes get raised that way, right? But I think in most books, you sort of go in knowing what that big stake is, and then as the book goes, you progress with the different stakes. And I agree, that is the way it should go. So yeah, it's interesting though. I never really thought about it in terms of like goals and the equation to the goal of the story being the stakes as well. So it's
I do remember what you said at the very beginning about the difference between wants and needs, and I've always thought like it's resonated with me that what a character wants isn't a great idea for a story. What a character needs is. But then it's interesting to bring in this new element. And I'd never thought about it in terms of like the external factor is what he wants or she wants, and the internal factor is what she needs. And I think that's another brilliant piece of advice that makes you kind of ask some questions about your ideas for a story.
Right. And if you're having trouble distinguishing between sort of what my character wants and what my character needs, sort of the easy way to think about it is put it in terms of a yes/no question. If you can answer it with a yes or a no, that's an external stake. You know, like, will Frodo throw the cursed ring into Mount Doom? Yes or no? Or, you know, will Emma marry Mr. Knightley who lives next door? Yes or no? That's a yes or no question. But as far as the internal stakes with that need, that's not really something you can answer with a yes or no question. You know, you can say, oh, this person wants happiness, or they want safety, or they want security. Well, what does happiness mean? And happy for how long? And you know, it's not something that you can point to. It's not concrete. So usually the internal stakes and the external stakes are in direct opposition from to one another. So you've got, you know, Scrooge, who wants money, but he needs love. Or in like, let's say The Martian by Andy Weir. You know, what he wants is to go home, right? What he wants, or really what he wants, is to survive Mars, you know, and to get off the planet. But what he needs is really that community. He needs to be together with other humans. So, you know, you have to achieve the one by achieving the other.
Yeah, it always reminds me of I don't know if you guys studied this in school, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And that little pyramid that they had, and it was, you know, like love and belonging. Yeah, well, I don't even know if food was in there. You know, it was like psychological needs and self-esteem and love and belonging, which is like what you're saying with The Martian. I think he needed that love and belonging, that need for people, right? And I think at the top was like a self-actualization. You know, there's you're becoming a better person, or understanding your role in life and this and that. And so yeah, for sure. So those are definitely what a lot of good stories with good characters are always working on, sort of the character growing through meeting those internal needs. So yeah. So how does one raise the stakes properly throughout their story?
The best way to raise the stakes is to make the consequences for failure worse. So humans, our fictional characters are humans, and humans are scared and lazy creatures, and we're not going to shake up the status quo unless we have to. So, you know, you have to kind of force your heroes into doing these things by making failure not be an option. Like I always say, there's no backsies in fiction. Once Dorothy sets foot on that yellow brick road, she's on a one-way trip to the Emerald City. Or in the Hunger Games, once Katniss raises her hand and says, I volunteer as tribute, you know, they put her on TV and they give her a new dress and they ship her off to the Capitol, and she really can't change her mind. So once you reach the midpoint and those really big stakes have sort of come to the forefront, the hero or heroine has to sort of realize at that point that, oh my gosh, I can't fail at this. I'm going to be worse off than when the story began if I fail. The stakes in every story are life and death of some kind. It doesn't have to be literal life or death. It can be symbolic. It can be death of a relationship. It can be death of, your standing in the community. It can be death of your freedom, but there has to be some kind of life or death stakes in every book.
And then that's like in the Jack Reacher books, like I mentioned, those are usually very literal. They're very like, he's gonna die if he doesn't do this. Somebody's gonna die if he doesn't
Somebody's
do this,
gonna
right?
die. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that so like if you were to look at different genres, if you were to look at romance, for instance, then often it's probably the relationship side of it, the death of a relationship, or whether or the inability to even start a new relationship, or maybe it's the death of not necessarily in romance, but in probably a lot of different genres, the death of the kind of person you were, and the kind of person you want to be, all that sort of thing, where it's more internal, because that's a lot of times there's that personal growth that we were saying throughout the story. And so a lot of that is probably life and death in a non-literal sense, right?
Right.
Yeah. Oh, that does make sense. But yeah, so would you say it's in a lot of stories it's one raising of the stakes, or is it this step ladder of stakes that just keep raising? Like, I know, again, in the Jack Reacher books, I think it's more of that step ladder, but I don't know if that's the way it is in most thrillers, sure, but I don't know if in other genres maybe there's less.
Anne of Green Gables, I was just thinking or there are other books, I guess, that don't have life or death, but they kind of do, because I guess it's like the character's life.
And I haven't read Anne of Green Gables, I confess. So I don't know what's at stake in those stories, but I bet if you look, you'll find life or death stakes of some kind, whether it's, a relationship, or it's, her sense of self, or her standing in the community. A lot of coming of age books, which I think Anne of Green Gables is, the life or death stakes are, is she going to come of age and be an independent adult?
I just read Catcher in the Rye, and I was trying to put that in the same thing, and that's exactly it. It's like, okay, there aren't any life or death stakes in terms of somebody dying, but it's like, is this guy going to be a useless bum, or is he going to find some purpose? Right.
So sometimes they're a little more subtle in some of the genres. Like Craig was saying, like with thrillers, it's pretty obvious that the life or death is going to be literal life or death. That is Jack Reacher going to die in this situation? Or, in the Hunger Games, is Katniss going to die? Or in Jaws, like, are they going to kill the shark, or are they going to be killed by it? But it can also be symbolic in a lot of genres. So I think where writers get into trouble is when they sort of tie themselves into knots, trying to, figure out how and when and where to raise the stakes. Speaking of thrillers, the best title for a thriller novel ever, I will stand by this. The best title that a thriller book ever had was a book by Tom Clancy, and it's called A Clear and Present Danger. That is the perfect title, because it says what's in it. It says what the stakes are going to be. Stakes always have to be clear. The reader has to know what's at stake, which you would think would be obvious, but you would be surprised. I work as an editor. A lot of times books come to me for editing, and I am not sure what's at stake. So the external stakes have to be very, very clear, and they have to be present. This has to be something that's happening right now. This has to be something with a deadline. Like in Jaws, they have to kill the shark before it takes out another swimmer on Amity Island. Or in The Martian, Mark Watney has to get off of Mars before he starves to death. So there has to be a deadline involved. So that's the present part. And then the danger part is the part we talked about, those life or death consequences that, that if you fail, you are going to be worse off than when the story began. So if you're having trouble with your stakes, just think of that great book by Tom Clancy, A Clear and Present Danger.
Yeah, Craig, I don't know if you felt the same way, but when you were saying this is the best title of a book ever, I was like, okay, what's this going to be? And you built it up so much. I thought it would have to be like a letdown, but no, that worked. That was like, oh, wow. Yeah, you're right.
Well, I felt like it was a bit on the nose, right? Like, I mean, like
that title is so on the nose.
Yeah.
But it sold millions of copies. They made a movie out of it starring Harrison Ford. It clearly worked. And I don't know if Tom Clancy came up with this title or if that was his editor or his publishing house, but they certainly knew what they were doing and they knew how to reach thriller audiences.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, speaking of titles, so your book about raising the stakes is called No Hero Wants to Save the World. So what, isn't that what heroes want to do, right? So what do you mean by that title? What is what's behind that?
So I called my book No Hero Wants to Save the World because heroes don't. They really don't. It seems like that's what a hero wants to do. But really, heroes are only concerned at the outset with that small personal problem that we talked about earlier. Alan Grant just wants to dig for fossils, and Dorothy just wants to go home. And even in the Hunger Games, Katniss just wants to save her sister. That's really all that she wants to do, is just keep her sister safe. Usually, these things that happen to our heroes and heroines are the worst case scenario. Literally the worst thing that could ever happen to them just happened to them. I mean, when Katniss is at the reaping and they pull her 12-year-old sister's name out of the hat and says, you're going to be in the Hunger Games, that's literally the worst thing that could ever possibly happen to her. In The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy did not want her house to be blown to Oz. In The Martian, Mark Watney didn't want to be stranded on Mars and left for dead. These are always the worst things that could ever happen to these people. And so they don't set out wanting to save the world, but these horrible things happen to them. And they're like, well, I guess it's up to me. I'm going to have to be the one to do it. Once those dinosaurs are out and start eating people in Jurassic Park, Alan Grant doesn't really have a choice here. He's going to have to try to save those little kids and save himself from these dinosaurs. I would say if
that makes sense.
Your hero is jumping into something like willingly, that's just nutso. Like, who would do that?
Superheroes. That's the one case. Once you started saying that, I started thinking back to all the different books I've read, fantasy and science fiction and even thrillers, even with Jack Reacher. You're right. They're always this person that was picked from obscurity for whatever reason, and they're the ones that have to save the world. And they don't necessarily know that that's what it is when they get started. Sometimes they do. You're the one. You're the chosen one. Blah blah blah. But sometimes it's just like builds up to that, and then it's like, I guess I'm here. I got to do what I got to do, and whatever, right? And I even something in my head is I can't remember which book or movie it is, but just the person constantly complaining, I wasn't even supposed to be here today, But
that was Clerks.
Yeah. Well, okay, no, yeah, maybe it was that. I feel like it was something else as well. But yeah, that's true. Clerks, he does that. So then I'm thinking. So usually, who is a hero that that really wants to be a hero. They're always like that. And then I thought superheroes, they're the ones that want to be heroes.
But
right?
do they though?
They don't want to necessarily become the hero at the beginning,
right.
But once they become the hero, they take on that role. And I guess I'm thinking of it in terms of comics. Like Superman knows that he's there to save the world and he's taken on that role. And maybe that's not what he would have picked if that was his if on Krypton, sure. And I mean, that's what made him the hero. But yeah, you're right. Like, sure, they all have their origin stories and they weren't born into that necessarily. But with comic books, because they're serialized and they eventually turn into the person who knows they have the Justice League. That's their job. I'm a hero. I do that. That's me. But you're right. At the beginning, though, that's not necessarily the case. Yeah.
I'm thinking about, when you say superheroes, I'm thinking about the first Thor movie. And that is a great case of just starting out with the personal stakes. At the beginning, Thor thinks that he is going to go down to Earth and he's going to grab his hammer from where his father so carelessly left it. And he is going to just pick it up and he's going to fly back to Asgard. I mean, he thinks this is going to be like a 5-minute job, like maybe 10 minutes tops. He's going to go to Earth, grab his hammer, go home. So that's really all he's thinking about. And he thinks once he grabs that hammer from Earth, that he's going to go right back to Asgard and be king. Of course, by the midpoint, his brother has taken over the throne and all the 9 realms are like at war and like his dad is like out of commission. And like by the midpoint, he realizes that it's up to him, that he really has to save all the realms. But that's not what he starts out thinking.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think most of them, they're reluctant at the beginning and then they sort of get into it, like all the Avengers. I guess even in those things, sometimes you have that person who really says he wants to be a hero, so he wants the power and this and that, and then it ends up corrupting them, and they become the villain usually. Those people that are searching it out, right?
I think in some ways Thor is kind of a twist on that, because he's like, he wants to be the hero, but he's a reluctant hero because he wants to be the hero, and it's like, look, this is something in which you actually get to be a hero, but it's like, because it's not what he imagines it's going to be. He doesn't want to be the hero in that scenario. Whereas to your point, Craig, I guess Thanos thought he was the hero, didn't he? He thought he was saving.
Well, there's that saying, everybody's the hero of their own story, right? So Thanos, most villains aren't thinking of themselves as villains. They're thinking of themselves as, they're right and what they're doing is right and everyone else is wrong. But it's all perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in your book, then you go through, I guess, the different types of stakes, the different ways to raise the stakes, the different genres, right? And how to do it in different genres, right? Because it's like we said, it's different. And then the inner stakes, the personal stakes, the outer stakes, all that stuff. So, and then what else? What else can do people need to know to get through the figuring out all the stakes and that sort of thing?
I'm trying to think, like, what didn't we cover? I can speak from my own experience as an editor, and I can talk about some of the things that have problems.
Yeah, like what do people do wrong? That's always like a great way to because that tells people, sometimes it's easier to see like the ways not to do things.
Right.
That sometimes gives a much better example than the ways to do things, especially when people are like, oh, I do that. And that might help them.
Right. I think in some genres like thrillers or like science fiction and fantasy, a lot of times, the writers have really, really good intentions and they have really, really good instincts. And their instincts say, well, I got to keep raising the stakes. I need to keep making them bigger and bigger and bigger. So, whatever they have at the midpoint scene that's big, they figure, well, okay, for the second half of the book, I need to make it even bigger yet. So, if at the middle of the book, this village is in danger, well, we have to make it bigger. So now we have to make the whole kingdom be in danger, or we have to make the whole world be in danger. Or if they're writing, let's say they're writing something that's more on like a literary side of things, where, they have sort of this, the midpoint scene is where the wife finds out that the husband is having an affair. So, okay, now I got to make it bigger. So maybe I'll like throw in like an accidental pregnancy and, maybe some STDs too while I'm at it. So
Wow.
the problem with that is a lot of times these authors, they're, again, great instincts. They're really, really trying to make their story work. But by making the stakes bigger, they neglect to make them more meaningful. So it's really, really hard for a reader to get very worked up about the fate of the whole world. It's too big. It's too abstract. You have to sort of bring it down to that human level and find out, who is this really going to affect that I care about? If you look at Lord of the Rings, like Frodo's trying to throw that ring into Mount Doom and he wants to save all of Middle Earth. But who he's really, really trying to save are the people of the Shire, his own little village. He's even at the very last minute, like that's all he's thinking about is how can I save my village, my people? So bigger isn't always better if you don't have that personal connection to make it meaningful. The other thing that I see writers do is I do see them sometimes trying to cram those big external stakes right in chapter 1. And it never works because those are not stakes that readers can relate to. And it also sort of makes the heroes look a little silly for being so eager to run into danger. Like if they knew the real stakes up front, most of them would run in the other direction.
It's like we scream at the TV when like the guys in horror movies go down and check the basement or split up or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Don't do it.
Don't do it. I mean, can you imagine, like, let's just take Jurassic Park, like go back to that for an example. Can you imagine if Hammond went to Alan Grant and told him what the stakes were going to be up front? If he told him, like, instead of saying, hey, do you want to go to my dinosaur park for a weekend and then go back home and dig for fossils? If he told him the truth up front, he's like, hey, do you want to go to my dinosaur park where there's a bunch of carnivorous dinosaurs and they're all escaped from their cages and you're gonna like see a bunch of your friends get eaten, and also there's a hurricane that cut off all power to the island and so no help is coming? Like, right. Grant would never take that deal.
Right. And I mean, those are good ways that they've ramped up the stakes. Like in a book, you don't want to blow it all in the first chapter anyways, right? What else are you going to do for the rest of it?
Exactly. And that's the other problem is if you try to put your external stakes in chapter 1, there's really nowhere for the book to go. So I see this a lot in romances, actually. Where they end up just kind of recycling the main conflict over and over and over because there really isn't anywhere else for the story to go.
That's really interesting because I read a lot of romance and I think that I recognize that.
Right. So if they had instead saved some of their, kept their powder a little dry for later in the book, then they wouldn't have to keep recycling the main conflict over and over. And if you do end up, I mean, people in real life, they do sort of tend to revisit the same conflicts. That's kind of what humans do. But you should at least be revisiting it on a different level. There should be more complications to what the conflict was.
And then I wonder too, like this is probably more an issue in maybe fantasy books and I don't know, maybe some thrillers too, where the first book in a series has like this grand I gotta save the world thing, right? And then it's like, but they want to do a next book, and maybe they didn't plan that way, but the first book did so well and people want another book, and then it's like, well, we just saved the world, so where do we go from here? Right? Like, how do I raise the stakes in book 2? And often they can't, right? And often it's like, I'll save the world again, but a different way. Yes. And I see that a lot, right? Especially from books. The one example that always comes to mind, and listen, this book came out 32 years ago. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia page. 32 years ago. I read it when I was much, much younger. So, forgive me if my memory of it is hazy, but what always stuck with me was, so The Eye of the World was the first book for the Wheel of Time series, right? Robert Jordan's big fantasy epic. It was 13 books. The guy died before it was even done. Sanderson had to come in and finish it. But what struck me at the time was when he started writing it, and I've never actually even looked this up to see if it's true. In my mind, this is what happened. He was writing it as a trilogy. I'm convinced of this. And the whole first 2 books, at least, were building up to this. It was clear it was meant to be a trilogy. It wasn't meant to be one book. Building it up to this, like, oh, the bad guy, and we're going to defeat him, and we all have to do this, and blah, blah, blah. In the halfway through, I think, book 3, there was the shift where it became, but that's not the real bad guy. There's an even bigger bad guy. And I'm convinced that it was supposed to be a trilogy. And by book 3, it was doing so well that his publishers were like, you can't stop now. And he's like, but I've been building up to this bad guy. And they're like, figure it out. And he's like, all right. But this isn't the real bad guy. It annoyed me at the time because it was just so clearly building that way in my head. And then it became, but no, because it hadn't really been mentioned, right, until sort of maybe halfway through the 3rd book. And it was just like, it's just that was, to me, it was like, I've raised the stakes I was building up to it, and now I've got to raise them even more. So there's a bigger bad guy. And I don't know. I mean, sometimes it goes too long. And I think that that's probably a problem with a lot of sort of series, right, where, you can't keep raising them forever. At some point, like you've got as high as you can realistically, and then you've got to figure out some other way to keep raising them.
Right.
So that's got to be a common issue that you see too, I would imagine, right?
Right. And I mean, there's different kinds of series. So there's the kind of series where it's sort of meant to be all read as one long story. So, if you look at the 3 books in the Hunger Games trilogy, they're all meant to be read in order and read as one big story. And then there's ones like you see, like with the Jack Reacher books that you mentioned, or with, some murder mysteries where it's just sort of the monster of the week. And we're just going to solve these smaller problems in an episodic way. But story stakes intersect with those series in a really interesting way, because when you have that episodic kind of thing where you have like a lot of the thrillers, a lot of the murder mysteries have that, there's usually the external stakes are solved at the end of every book. So we've defeated this bad guy, or we caught this murderer at the end of the book. But the internal stakes are not resolved at the end of the book, and those carry over to the next book. A great one that I'm thinking about is the Stephanie Plum books by Janet Ivanovich. And Stephanie is a bounty hunter, and she's very comically bad at her job. And she has this kind of on again, off again boyfriend. And so at the end of every book, in the Stephanie Plum series, she always catches her bad guy and she always solves the mystery. But her personal problems with her family and with her on again, off again boyfriend, and with like the ways she's having trouble adulting, those continue from book to book. So I always say that when the external stakes are solved, the book is over. But when the internal stakes are solved, the series is over.
Yeah.
Because if Stephanie Plum ever did settle down with her boyfriend and, you know, solve all of her internal problems, that would be the end of the series. They wouldn't have anywhere else to go with it. So,
Right. I think that's the way Jack Reacher is, except that I don't feel like his internal stakes are ever really moving forward. I feel like he's the same guy in every single book. And there's always story stakes, and it's not building into some grander thing. So it doesn't have that same issue that I found with like Wheel of Time or with some fantasy novels where, you know, we've got to save the world and it takes a few books, but then when you've done it, now you want to keep going. It doesn't make as much sense. But with his, it's like, you know, whatever the issue is of the book, it gets resolved. He sometimes has a relationship. Every single girl that he meets in these books is always good looking and is always young and is always like his type and whatever. And then he hooks up with them, and then he goes a separate way and nothing. I don't know. So far, I'm only, 6 or 7 books in. I haven't noticed his character changing at all from book to book, but that's fine too, right? Like they've got their story stakes, and that's sort of what you're there for in a Jack Reacher book, I think. But I think that you're right in a lot of stories, especially like romance series, standalone series. You know, you can pick it up anywhere, but the character is sort of growing and changing throughout a lot of the times, or their relationship, or sometimes they'll switch to a minor character, they become the major character in the next book, and then you watch their internal stakes grow and change, right? So that's another way of doing it.
Right. Jack Reacher is a very I haven't read many of them, I confess, but he's very like a James Bond kind of character, right?
Yeah.
Like a little bit larger than life and like a super tough guy. So what would happen if he ended up settling down with one of these many women that he dates throughout the book? It wouldn't be the same character anymore, like that.
Yeah, and he wouldn't be able to go on these adventures anymore, right?
No.
I mean, part of it is he, in James Bond, he works for an organization that'll send him on missions. In the way they've got around that in the Jack Reacher books is he has no attachments, he has no property, he has no possessions. He walks around with the same clothes. When they're too dirty or smelly, he throws them out and buys new ones. Like he literally doesn't travel with anything. But he just ends up always getting into these crazy adventures. but yeah, you're right. If he was to settle down, that would kind of have to stop. And in fact, in one of the books, he meets a girl and it seems like, oh, they're going to get together. And by the end of the book, they're kind of living together. And you're like, oh, I wonder how this is going to work. And then in the next book, they break up. So it's like, okay, that's
right. Because if he were to settle down, it would make him vulnerable.
Right.
Because the bad guys could get to him through her.
Right. And I think that is spoiler alert. I think that is what happened in that book, is like they did try to get after her. And that's why the superheroes always, have their secret identities, right? So that, people don't find their families. But yeah, no, I think that, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that it sounds like there are a lot of different ways to sort of handle it when you're doing it in one story, or you're doing it in a series, or you're doing it in a standalone series, you're doing it in an interconnected series. It sounds like there are quite a lot of ways to raise the stakes.
Right. And genre plays a huge role in how you're going to do it. Every genre handles stakes differently. In thrillers, it usually is life or death. In romance, it's the death of a relationship. And the really big place that we see it is in the resolution. You can really, really tell what genre you're reading based on how they resolve the stakes. Because in genres like a thriller or like some science fiction and fantasy, you have to resolve the stakes by defeating the bad guy, either killing them putting them in jail, stopping their evil plan, whatever it is, the good guys are going to win and the bad guys are going to lose. That is how you resolve those stakes. Like there really isn't any other way to do it in that kind of genre. But in other genres, like romance, literary fiction, women's fiction, young adult, usually they don't want to defeat the antagonist. They want to reconcile with the antagonist. And of course, romance is the classic. You can totally see this because the two halves of the couple are going to reconcile at the end through a grand gesture and declarations of love. But you also see this a lot in literary fiction and women's fiction. A lot of those stories are family stories. So it's usually like adult children having trouble with their parents, or it's, parents having trouble with their children. So it's usually a family story, or it's like a really tight-knit community story. And in that case, they're not trying to defeat the people. They're not trying to defeat their mother or their child or whoever their sibling or whoever they're in conflict with. The resolution of those stakes are reconciliation, new understanding, and finally understanding my mother for the first time or something like that. And sort of that peace and harmony being restored. So that is sort of the goal of resolving those stakes.
That's fascinating. I don't know. Hopefully a lot of people listening to this have taken something away, because I know I have, and I've spent, just like you, I've spent a lot of time researching stories and how story structure works and stuff like this. But you've added some very interesting new elements, so I might have to go and check out your book further than I think you sent us a copy of your first one. I don't know if you sent us a copy of this one.
I did.
She did. Yeah. I think you were on that, but it was a while back. It was right after we recorded the first one. And so, yeah.
I'm sorry, my kids literally went back to school yesterday, so my brain has been mashed potato for the last 3 months. But
yeah, that's I agree. It's I think that there's a lot to take away from here, and no matter what genre you're writing, there's so many different ways to take. I think that's the important thing. A lot of people, they talk about wanting to do things differently, and they want to be unique and this and that, but there's a lot of key things to writing and storytelling that really need to be there, but it doesn't, they don't have to always be there the same way, right? There's different paths you can take to sort of still creating a story that works, right?
Yeah, and I think the danger is that we can sometimes get a little too prescriptive and say, we're breaking this down to its most simple elements. And so you have to have this element and this element and this element. But of course, within that, there is always ways to make it your own. And I hope in my book that I can sort of empower people to do that. I've sort of tried to break story stakes down into their most simple elements, but to do so in a way that people can sort of take from it and say, oh, this is how it applies to my book. This is how I can make story stakes work for me. So
I think that is wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we are nearly at the top of the hour, so we have to cut this conversation short. But this has been a really, really educational podcast, just like your last one, actually. So hopefully people have got a huge amount of value out of it. Craig, do you have any final questions before we wrap up?
No, I agree that I think that you have broken it down into very understandable pieces and really shown people the ways that the different kinds of stakes, the different genres, it's not just you can only do it with this genre. It's not just I think that is what a lot of people think about when they just maybe think about it peripherally is thrillers, right? That's where you really can visualize the raising of the stakes, because you're thinking of it literally of life and death. And you're like, oh, now he's getting in this situation and this situation. But it can be applied to the other genres. You just don't take it as literally. And I think that's really a very important takeaway for people. I hope it was for me, at least. So thanks.
That is wonderful. Well, thank you very much. And hopefully, if you have been listening to this or watching it on YouTube and you really appreciate what Alex had to say, which I'm sure you did, make sure to leave her a comment down below and let her know and ask any questions you want. We will, of course, be posting links to her book and her website, so you can go and check it out there. And aside from that, we are so delighted to have you here, Alex. Hopefully, we'll have you back one more time. And stay tuned, everybody, to another episode of Fully Booked coming next week.